Well, good day, everyone. Thanks for joining our weekly Chingu Roundtable session. In today's session, we're going to be covering how to use the PayPal REST API in your applications. Um, so what we're going to do is show you a sample application. We're going to go through what the PayPal REST API looks like and how you use it. We'll talk about how you can customize the appearance in your applications. And we're also going to go through some gotchas, some things that aren't necessarily done well in the API, or at least things that you need to be aware of. Probably shouldn't be so harsh. So with that, let's get started. Uh, Let me pull up our chat window. If you have any questions or uh, concerns, anything at all, why feel free to type them in the YouTube chat. I'm going to. So we're glad you're able to make it today. So with that, let's dive right in. Um, I'm going to open up a quick slide. So again, this is what we're here to talk about today, is about using the PayPal API, and specifically the REST API. So one question that comes up is, why would you want to do something like this? Well, outside of the obvious, oh, I'm writing a commercial website that needs to accept payments from customers, just as a web developer who's learning the craft of web development, at some point you're going to get tired of doing to-do applications and recipe boxes and those kinds of things. You're going to want to develop an application, even if it's only for yourself to learn with, that does some type of payment, or at least payment simulation, because that's obviously something that employers do, and skills that they need and they look for from candidates. So that's why you would want to use this. Now, what is PayPal? Uh, PayPal is used very heavily in North America, not as much in other parts of the world. It's two things. It started out its life as an online clearinghouse for online shopping payments. And it's morphed into a digital wallet that supports uh, sending and receiving money between individuals, not just uh, companies or commercial enterprises. So, for example, if my son lives in a different city, and if he needs some help, he needs some money, I could use PayPal to transfer money to him. There are a lot of other solutions to that particular problem, not just PayPal, um, but it is one thing that it can do. Now, some facts about PayPal: it's actually a fairly large organization. They've been around since 1998, so it's essentially 22 years they've been in business. They are available for use in 200 plus countries and regions around the globe. However, as I said earlier, they're really more popular in North America, although they are working hard at expanding their presence. Some metrics that gives you an idea of their scale. They have 429 million users and merchants. They've processed $340 billion US dollars worth of payments, over 5.5 billion transactions. So that's quite an extensive workload, a large workload. And they have 31,000 employees right now. So they are a large organization. And if you're wanting to learn more about PayPal, you can always go to their main website, https ://paypal.com. So I'm going to double check our the chat window. So something before we get into the technology, something to understand about PayPal is that when you're using it for credit or debit card payments, or just paying through PayPal itself, um, there are transaction fees that are added to every purchase. So if you're using PayPal to collect your revenue or to basically process the financial portion of a transaction, they're going to charge you for that. Pardon me. So if you're using PayPal checkout, they're going to charge 3.5% of the total transaction amount plus another 49 cents. So if you do the math on a $25 purchase, that's about $1.36, $1.36 to use them to complete that transaction. Now, if you're using standard, pardon me, credit cards or debit cards, it's a little bit less. It's about 3% that's charged on the total transaction fee plus another 49 cents. So in the case of this $25 purchase, it's $1.24. So it's about 12 cents less than what it is to use PayPal. And this is my own opinion, but I believe this is one reason PayPal isn't used as extensively outside North America, is it has a little bit higher transaction fee than similar services. And you can shop around. Probably the biggest competitor in this space is a company called Stripe. So the other thing to keep in mind is you can use the PayPal API to test payment transactions or to test payments, which is really good if you're a developer who's learning how to do this. But as soon as you want to take this to production, to enable it, you're going to have to create a PayPal business account, and you're going to have to link that account with a bank account. And that's really to your benefit because whenever funds are processed, sales are completed, PayPal will transfer those to your bank account. So that's why it needs your bank account information. So let's take a look now at more of the technology. How do you use this? How do you add this to your application? Well, step one is you'll note right up at the top we have an import for @PayPal/PayPal.js. This is known as the PayPal JavaScript SDK. And this is a JavaScript discussion. So everything we talk about here is going to be in terms of JavaScript. But you will have to do an npm install of this library to get it into your application. And then once it's there to invoke it, you'll execute a load script command from that library. And what load script does is it invokes the API. It gives you the ability to customize the appearance of things like the PayPal buttons on your page. And then it also will inject or will allow PayPal to inject its DOM elements into your web page. So that actually, is a plus. What it means is that you don't have to create a form for collecting the credit card information. I mean, you can if you want, but you don't have to. The PayPal API can do that on its own. And we'll show you in a second how that works. The next thing is that there are 4 entry points that are invoked by the PayPal API at different times in its execution cycle. So the first one is on a knit. So this is invoked once after PayPal has done the customization, any customization you specify, and after it's injected its DOM elements into your web page. So this will get invoked. Now, you don't have to put anything here. We're going to show you an example in a moment of why you may want to use this, but it's not required. So the next function is create order. When your user clicks the button that says, hey, I want to pay using a credit card or a debit card, for example, this create order function gets invoked. And this is where you can supply additional information to the PayPal API that describes the transaction to be paid. So I think the minimum data that's required is you need to tell PayPal what is the total cost of this transaction. In other words, your application will have a shopping cart of some kind. You may have one or more items that your user has elected to purchase, and they've specified the number of units, the quantity for each of those items. And so your app has to calculate what's the total face value of those goods and services that you're selling and provide that to PayPal. And that's so that PayPal knows, first of all, what transaction fee should be charged, but it has to communicate this to the credit card company so that they can approve or deny the transaction. The next function is on approve. Once PayPal approves the transaction, this will get invoked. So this is really a handy function. This is where you can do things like creating a receipt or emailing a purchase acknowledgement to your end user. And then the final entry point is on error. If at any point PayPal encounters an error or detects an error, it will invoke this function and it'll pass you information about the error. So you can diagnose what happened. You can hopefully fail gracefully or supply information to your user to allow them to retry the transaction. Hopefully you'll do something other than just issuing a console log that says something went wrong. And in the final part of this really isn't a function per se. Well, I guess it is actually, but you use the render to specify the ID of a DOM element where you will allow PayPal to inject its buttons and forms into your web page. So I'll show you in just a minute what this looks like in your HTML and in your JavaScript. But essentially, this is just an HTML element, like a div, that has an ID associated with it. In our case, in this example, we've said that ID is PayPal-button-container. You could name this anything you want. And so what this does is this allows you to dictate to PayPal where in the web page do you want it to put its elements. So let's move on. So that's enough slides for now. Let's switch over and actually I want to show you the demo application that we're using to demonstrate this. It is written in SvelteKit and Tailwind. That's just because that's what I like to work in. You can use React, Angular, Vue.js. You could use native JavaScript if you want. This API does not assume that you'll be using any type of front-end framework or CSS preprocessor at all. We're going to use a really simple checkout form. In fact, it's not a form at all. It's just some input fields. We're going to use them and show you how the PayPal REST API gets invoked when certain events occur in that, like on button clicks. And then we'll also dive fairly deep into what gets injected into your DOM, your document object model by PayPal, because that's going to be pretty important in a couple cases. So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code. And let's look at the application. Actually, I closed that browser too quickly. I want to flip over to the application to show you what it looks like. So I'm going to refresh it. All right, so this is a really simple application. We have a mock checkout form. Presumably, the user has already selected an item from our product catalog, in this case, a left-handed monkey wrench. The unit price was extracted from the catalog. In this case, it's $34.99. And what we need to do as a user is now specify how many of these things do we want to purchase And then we'll click out, or we'll click the checkout button when we're ready to complete the transaction. So let's do that. Let's just purchase one of these. So we can see at a single unit that was $34.99 as a total. If we choose to buy two of these, it's $69.98. So now let's do the checkout. So at that point, when I click the checkout button, you can see that our application invoked PayPal, and PayPal put these two buttons in our web page. This lets us select, do we want to pay using PayPal itself, the PayPal wallet, or do we want to pay using a standard debit or credit card? So let's just walk through this as a user. We'll show what does this look like. Then we'll back up and we'll dive into the code and relate the how we coded this to the actions on this screen. So let's click debit or credit card. Okay, you can see PayPal inserted a form, and you're used to this. If you pay by credit card, this form is very similar to any other kind of payment mechanism. We have to provide the credit card number, some security information, and then some information about ourselves. Now, this data, unless your application chooses to save this, all of this is really, all of this transaction information is manipulated and saved by PayPal, not your application. So you don't have to retain any of this. And in fact, there is an argument that says, you may not want to maintain this or save this for security purposes. Your application may not want the security overhead of saving someone's credit card number, because if that happens, that means that you have to take some more stringent and some more rigid steps to ensure the security of your customer's information, and that may not be something that you choose to do. All right, so that's at this point we're using the PayPal API, but it's going through the PayPal test system, not the production system. So we need to get a test credit card number. So over in developer.paypal.com, in the REST API section, there is a card testing topic. And one of the things you can do is that you can generate a credit card for testing. So in this case, we already have one generated. That's the number. It expires in August 2025, and it has a security verification code of 681. So let's go complete this form using that information. So there's our credit card number, we've got our expiration date, and we've got our security code. So now I'm just going to complete the rest of the form. So bear with me while I type all this in. So that's all of our information. So again, this is not a real credit card number. This is a test credit card provided to us by PayPal. And similarly for this information, I've mocked this test data. This is not a real phone number, not a real street address, whatnot. So now that we've done that, let's click the Pay Now button and we'll see what happens. So our transaction is completed now. Now, this application is really simple. What I should have done is I should have included some type of acknowledgement or payment receipt. So let's go look at the code and we'll walk through this in a bit more detail. So since this is a Svelte app, It's a single page app, and really almost all of the code is included in this page.svelte file inside our routes subdirectory. So the first thing is we've imported the PayPal JavaScript SDK. We're defining some variables that we're using to calculate the total cost. There's some state variables that control whether or not those PayPal DOM elements or the PayPal section of your web page is displayed or not. And then there's some event handlers to handle things like button clicks. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go down to the checkout button, and we can see that whenever that checkout button is clicked, that's going to invoke the handle checkout function. And what the checkout function, handle checkout, does is it toggles this is payment visible to true, and it calculates the total cost based upon the quantity specified by the end user. Now this is payment visible. What this does is this controls whether or not the PayPal part of your web page is displayed or not. And again, remember earlier I said that you use this div and ID to tell PayPal where to place its elements on the web page. Well, this is where that's done. Again, I've got this div with an ID of PayPal-button-container. And if I scroll up to where we've invoked PayPal, that's that load script function, there is a .render function where I've let PayPal's API know this is the ID of the element where you can inject your updates to my page. So that's how that is done. And then this is visible, is payment visible, we set that to true. This is svelte logic. This is in my HTML in essence. This is a conditional that's saying if is payment visible is true, display these elements. If it's not true, these elements should be hidden. So the syntax, this bracket ~if and bracket /if, these are unique to Svelte. Now, the other thing to show here is that we don't really have a form. You notice I don't have a form HTML tag. I've chosen to go a really simple route and just have some input fields and some labels. And I've bound, like the quantity, I've bound it to the variable quantity. And then when it's clicked, it's going to invoke this function update total cost. And all update total cost does is it calculates what's my total cost. Now, some of you have probably picked up on this. It would have been a slightly better programming practice to have a third function to calculate total cost. And I would invoke that from both of these spots where I've just repeated this code. So that's part of that dry principle, that do not repeat yourself. However, this isn't really a huge exposure because this is a pretty simple function, and it's used in functions that are adjacent to one another. So now you can see that's pretty much it. The code that we've written here really approximates what we showed on the slide deck. Create order is going to create an order. The onApprove, once the transaction is approved, we're just doing a console log to capture the results, which we'll see next. And then we've got this error trapping, which is way too simple. This is not how I would suggest doing this in real life. But for the purposes of this demo, it's fine. So let's flip over to DevTools. Oops. There we go. So we can see that when we completed this transaction, in that create order function, PayPal returned to us just an indication, hey, an order has been started and the user's elected to pay by some type of payment card, a credit card or a debit card. That's the only information you'll get back on create order. Now, when the end user actually completed the transaction, they filled out the form and they clicked on the pay now or the pay button. Then we get a little bit more information. So we get things like we get the information, all of the information the end user typed in on the form. So like their name, for example. We'll also get PayPal's unique identifier for us, basically for them, their payer ID. We'll get a transaction ID. We'll get purchase units, which basically define, how much was the user charged, what was the total charge. We'll also get this descriptor. If we had provided any shipping address, which we did, then we get that. So this is all information that's good for adding to a receipt or an acknowledgement that you send back to your user. Now, the one thing, notice that we don't see here is we don't see the credit card number. And that's because PayPal is trying to keep the transaction secure. And really, there's no need for us to capture the credit card number. That's why we're having PayPal do this. So I want to check our chat again briefly. Yeah, no comments. If at any point you have any comments or anything at all, feel free to enter them into the chat. I'll be happy to try to answer them. Now, next, let's take a look at the DOM elements, or basically the changes to our DOM that PayPal injects. It's basically these buttons. And I want to talk a bit about that on-init function in the PayPal interface. Remember that PayPal invokes it after it has added these to the DOM, but before they are displayed. So let's switch over. In DevTools, let's select this section. And let's take a look at what does this look like in essentially HTML. So you can see this is the div that we had in our code where we had that ID of PayPal button container. And again, this name can be anything. This is following our naming convention. PayPal is going to insert its elements into our web page wherever we tell it. So I could have named this ID equal Fred, and as long as in the source code on this render I said #Fred, that's where PayPal would have injected its changes to our web, or its elements into our web page. But now over in our code, let's scroll down to that section. In our code, you'll see we just have this div. There's nothing that follows it. Well, we know that PayPal injected its elements there because underneath this, we now have some new divs. And we'll see in a minute some forms and iframes as well. So these are items that were all added by PayPal. And if we expand this out, we'll see that one of the things PayPal is doing is all of this is embedded inside an iframe that it inserts. And when we click debit or credit, what happens? This form is actually in another iframe that's nested underneath or inside the iframe that contains the buttons. So at this point, you may be asking, that's really interesting, but why do I care? Well, there are a couple reasons you'll care. One is if you decide to add any automated testing, like a Playwright test or a Cypress test, to basically fill out this form, you're going to need to traverse the DOM in order to tell Cypress or Playwright or whichever test tool you're using where to put specific bits of information, like the card number, the expiration, the first name, and so on. So essentially, that's one reason you need to know about these iframes and how PayPal is composing its part of the web page. The other reason is a little more, it's a little more interesting. If I scroll down, you may have caught this before, you can see that this scrolls underneath my header. Well, the reason that it does that is because in the on init function that I provided in this test code, I'm actually locating that top level iframe and setting the Z index. And the reason I'm doing that is because my header component, it sets the Z index to 10. And the reason it's doing that is so that on the web page, everything scrolls underneath the header. In other words, this heading is fixed. Had I not done that, in fact, let's change this. Had I not added this Z index, let's just change this to 0. We'll let that recompile. And we'll update our form again, and we'll do a checkout. So now you can see I've got the form, but when I scroll, oh, I did the wrong Z index. Let me comment this out actually. If I don't assign a Z index, and now I do this, we should see this form overlay our header as we scroll. And in fact, it does. So that's really ugly. This is not a best practice to have this type of behavior. So the way that you can fix that is in the on init, you basically just locate the iframe and you dynamically set the Z index to a particular value. Now in my case, you notice I just took the first iframe, and I can get away with that because my web page has no iframes. So I know that the only iframes being injected in my web page are those that are added by PayPal. So this get elements by tag name is a function that says basically, get me all of the iframes and return the references to those DOM elements in a variable that's an array of references. And then as a little bit of protection, if that iframe, if nothing is returned, I'm going to produce an error message. I'm basically going to throw an error. So we've recompiled that. This should be back to the behavior that my form will scroll underneath the header. And in fact, it does. This is actually the behavior we wanted to see. So that's the code. That's the demo of how you use the PayPal API. And as you can see, it's relatively simple. Now again, we're presenting this to show you one option for payments. This doesn't mean that you would use PayPal or that it's the only solution. And you will find when you do your research that there are different payment mechanisms that are better for some parts of the globe than for others. Again, two of the popular ones are PayPal, but then there's also Stripe. And Stripe I've used, and I can tell you it's a very full-featured. They have lots of different credit and debit type options that make it easy to pay for purchases in most countries, in most regions in the world. So let's go back to our deck, kind of tie this up. So some things to consider. Uh, Credit card transaction fees aren't charged for tests. And I actually need to open up a ticket with PayPal. That PayPal testing system, I haven't seen that it's returned any transaction fees. And that's a question I need to ask them because it's obviously important that when you're testing, you want to test all conditions and all edge cases. Um, so it's really, I think it's really critical that we be able to test transaction fees. At least in my case, I want to put those transaction fees, I want to itemize them on the receipt that I provide to my end user. The other thing to keep in mind is that PayPal, the API, is going to inject these nested iframes into your web pages. That's important if you're going to do automated testing, or if you need to do some type of customization to what they're adding to your DOM. As in our case where we wanted to change that Z index. And just graphically, this simple diagram shows PayPal's inserting an outer iframe. It contains the payment buttons, but then nested in this outer iframe is the iframe that contains the payment form. Something we really didn't touch on that I need to go back is button shapes and colors can be changed from your code, and the payment method, different payment methods can be removed. So let's actually go back to that. I want to catch up on that because it's kind of important. Up at the top where we did the load script, you can see that there's this buttons clause or attribute. This is where we've told PayPal, I want my buttons to be blue. I want them to be rectangular rather than as a pill, basically one with a rounded corner. I want them to be vertical instead of horizontal. So you get some control over the appearance of the buttons here. The other thing that you can do, and which we've done, is there is a third default payment option called Pay Later. You can think of this as kind of similar to an installment payment through the PayPal system. So this lets you purchase the good or the service or the item, but you can elect to pay at a later point in time through PayPal. Well, I didn't want to allow that in this particular application. So one of the options I have is to disable funding. So this is part of the API. This is a well-defined attribute in the PayPal documentation. Again, I just said I don't want pay later to be an option. And in fact, let's go look at the API. You can see that there's quite a bit of documentation on the options, how you handle errors, also on how you make requests. These are actually showing you through curl because you can use Postman for your testing. And I think that's actually kind of a nice feature of their documentation, that they've thought ahead and given you instructions for how to use Postman before you write any code. And then there's a lot of other documentation. So the SDK, the JavaScript SDK, this is where you'll get information or can find information about what those options were, like we used to configure buttons. So remember, we did the style. We said color blue. We actually used the same one. As you go through the doc, you can see that these are different ways of having the buttons rendered. So you could do vertical or horizontal. You can set the color. There are limitations here, but you can set the color, whatnot, and the shape of the button. And then you can change the label. So I want to check our chat briefly. Oh, so here's a question. What is the best practice of implementing payment for digital downloads or subscriptions? Should I use webhooks? To be honest, I don't know necessarily the answer to that. I would say that, what the payment method we've described um, is good enough. I think the question is going to be, oh, I think I see. You're asking about webhooks because you also want to do the automatic delivery of the digital media that they've purchased. So yeah, that a webhook is not a bad approach. Although the other approach you can do is you could also keep it simple and just in this on approve function, this the code in on approve will only get invoked when PayPal has actually approved the payment. So they've verified that the user's credit is good, that they have the funds to payment or their credit history is good. You don't have to worry about any of that. So one of the options you could do is in this code, you could send an email that has a link to the digital media. So I think the point here is, or the answer is, there's multiple ways to do that. Webhooks is absolutely one way. I don't know that it's necessarily the best way, and it's certainly not the only way. So when a transaction is rejected, does it go to the on-error function? Yes, it does. And if we look at the documentation, let's look at the on-error function. There's some standard codes that PayPal has provided that identify specific types of errors that have occurred. And let's see if we can find what those are. If I go to the REST API, let's see if there's an error code section here. I have run across that, and I apologize. I probably should have had that queued up because that's a really good question. Let's look at negative testing. Here we go, test values. So in this section, I believe, yeah. Yeah, they have different values for certain types of errors. So for example, if the sender email is unconfirmed, this is how you can tell that. So you can test for that in your code. And you can see that in this case, they've provided the return items or the return values. This is essentially the object that will be returned to you when the error is detected. So you'll see this note that identifies, specifically what happened. And that's really good to know. It's actually a really good practice, I think, for any type of transaction processing or payment processing application, specifically like a shopping cart. It's really a good idea to do automated testing and make sure that you don't just test the quote happy path. You test, all of the edge cases and you test the errors as well. So one of the things you could do is remember in our when we did our test transaction a few minutes ago, we got that credit card number that had an expiration date and a verification code, credit card verification code associated with it. Personally, I would set up 3 tests, 3 negative tests using, in my case, I use Playwright. I would test for bad credit card number. I would test for bad expiration date. I would test for a bad credit card verification number. That's that 3-digit validation number. And then I would probably have a few other tests that test those different errors in combination, where I have an invalid credit card number and an invalid verification number, or I have a good credit card number, but an invalid expiration date and an invalid verification number, just to see what happens and to ensure that the flow, that those errors are caught, and the flow that my application follows allows the user to correct the error. Actually, I should restate that it provides actionable information to the user in language they can understand, and then also provides a path to let them correct it so they don't have to abandon the transaction. And I'm really glad you asked that, because that's a really important part of any application. You want to make things easy on your user. The worst thing is to be in a situation where there's an error and the user has to start over and re-enter everything. That will just cause frustration on their part. And that's analogous to the solution that we all are aware of in computers, which is reboot. You know, at an application level, that's very similar to rebooting. So I hope that answered your questions. Those are both really good questions, by the way. So I just want to pause. If there's any more questions, why, feel free to ask away. Otherwise, we're gonna wrap this up. This video will be available on YouTube for replay in about an hour. I will also, I'll see if I can't attach a PDF of the slide deck for you. In addition to the slides we've seen, there's one at the very end that's basically the resources where you can find this information. So I want to thank you for attending and for your questions. You know, the questions that you ask, I think, are really just as valuable as the content we provide, because it lets me tailor this to your needs. So with that, we'll close this one out, and we'll see you all next time. So thanks.